Welcome to Talkin' Waukesha, the podcast where every conversation springs to life.
I'm Andrew Nofke.
And I'm Anthony Terrell.
And we're your hosts for today's journey into the heart of Waukesha.
Whether you're a local or just passing through, join us as we explore the stories, people, and hidden gems that make Waukesha truly special.
From community events to personal anecdotes, we're here to bring you the pulse of our vibrant town.
So grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and let's dive into another episode of Talkin' Waukesha,
where every conversation springs to life. Welcome to another episode of Talkin' Waukesha. Today we're here with Dan Carstens, who is the Waukesha Fire Department's historian, among other things.
Thank you.
Let's start off. Can you tell us a little bit about your background with the fire department and what drew you to documenting the department's history?
Well, I was one of those little kids who was crazy about fire engines and fire trucks ever since I was probably 4 years old. And I remember at the time when my parents we'd go on a drive or a vacation, we'd drive past a fire station with the doors open. I screamed and hollered until they stopped and I could look inside. So I always had that interest. Then in 1959, when the Waukesha Freemen had their centennial, it was a big deal. They had all those sheets, I don't know if you've seen in the newspaper, every week they had a history. And one of the Saturdays, they published 2 or 3 pages of old photographs of Waukesha Fire Department, and I was totally mesmerized by that. So I clipped all those articles, and from then on, I would clip anything fire history related. I was appointed to the fire department. I did other careers first, but I was appointed to the fire department on April 1st, 1975. In a couple of weeks, it'll be 50 years.
Yeah, that's great.
And Chief Land at the time realized I was very much interested in the history. No one was too much, but he found 2 boxes that he gave to me of Pete Wild. I'll talk a little bit about him later. He was a very prominent fire chief in Waukesha. So I started delving into the history. And I was lucky at that time when I started, there were still a lot of guys that were World War II-ish guys that started in the 40s. And I talked to them and asked them questions and listened to their stories. And they worked with the guys that started in the early part of the 19th century, back when they still had horses, guys like Arch Slay, Ben Zellers. And so I got their stories like secondhand.
Oh, very cool.
So I got to piece together a lot of, and for some reason I remembered everything. And so I kept collecting stuff, pictures, anything fire related. And when I left the fire department, I kept it going. And I didn't know what I was going to do with this stuff, but I just felt that it was my obligation to keep track. I kept a large roster of all the paid guys and their date of birth and the dates they started and their promotions, that type of thing. So I did that, and I even found Waukesha's original fire bell that was cast in 1842. I found the cornerstone from one of the original stations. I even bought a 1931 Persh pumper. So, and all that I donated back to the fire department. In fact, some years back, I built some oak cabinets, and most of that's displayed on the second floor.
Oh, yeah.
So I always had this idea in my mind to write a book about it, but I knew what a huge endeavor that was, and I knew I just didn't have the time. Well, about 7 years ago, different people had told me, you got to write a book, Well, that's easy to say.
Right.
So 7 years ago, I decided if I don't do it, it'll never be done, and it'll all be lost to the wind. So I decided I'm going to do it. So I started that project. And I had a lot of run books from the 1800s to 1940, my articles, but everything department history record-wise from 1940 was gone. They hauled it up to City Hall many years ago, and it evaporated.
Yeah.
So I had to reconstruct the history. So I spent days and days at the library going through the film on a microfiche of the old Freemans, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, I read them all, in order to reconstruct that history.
And did those have like the reports of like almost police blotter style, but
no,
like reports
it was more news reports, but they were more in-depth years ago than they are now. Sadly, now they really only report on something they get a press release on, and they say what's in the press release.
Right.
You know, but years ago, you had reporters that would come to the fires. When they were slow, they'd come to the fire station looking for a story, and they do human interest story. Plus, like things like promotions would all be in there. Now you just don't see that. So I collected that all, and I did the book about 3 years ago. And I'm very proud of that accomplishment.
Yeah, when I was looking you up, I saw the book and saw I think one copy of it on eBay for like $85 or something like that. But
yeah. I had 350 published, and I think there's only about 25 left.
Yeah.
Out of that. So
I mean, it's from the beginning till I think 2000, 2020?
2022, right
Yeah.
after just about the Christmas parade era.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
In fact, it stopped just before the Christmas parade, but I put that in as a special chapter just because it was such a big deal.
Right. I mean, but that's
and I approached it from the fire department's response to that without getting into anything else.
yeah. I mean, that's such a fantastic chunk of history that you've documented.
Right, and all the new recruits on the fire department for the past 8 or 9 years, I give a talk. As part of their training, they get 1 hour of fire department history, and I bring in my slideshow. And it's very important. The fire department is based on tradition, like as much as even maybe more so than the military.
Right.
And the one cool thing, I don't know if you've ever seen down at Station 1, it wasn't my idea, but in the back stairwell, have you been there?
Yeah, I have.
You walk up the back stairwell and you see the names of all the guys. I don't know how many are on there, but several
There's
hundred.
a lot of them, yeah.
Their dates of service. And the thought is, all these new guys, they come in every day and they walk up that stairs and they see all the names that preceded them, and that history.
Yeah, it's such I mean, I don't know if we've got a picture of it. If we don't, we'll have to try and find one.
I know I've taken video for it for some other projects we've done. So definitely we could show something like that.
It's such a cool experience, kind of seeing like you see all the names of everyone. I mean, if I remember it, it's all bricks, right?
Yeah, every name is on a
blocks.
brick.
Mark Sweet and Javier Fernandez were the two firefighters that sort of put that together, and it's being kept by.
Yeah, it's a very cool thing to walk through.
Yeah, and it's anyone who's been a Waukesha firefighter, even if you've only been in it for a day, right? Like
Right, and when I did the book, I realized halfway through it was all about the camaraderie and the guys that were there. So I made a point of trying to get a picture of every paid member of the fire department, and Of course, the numbers have changed now, but I think it was 349 of the 370 firefighters that I have pictures of in that book. So
that's fantastic.
They're not lost to history.
Incredible.
And going back to earlier, when you're talking about being a kid, looking and wanting to always see the fire stuff, I had that kind of a similar experience. So when they just got the new truck at Station 4, I was there when they were bringing it in and getting clean and watching them. Like, I feel like a kid in a candy store right now. I'm watching this, really cool fire truck being, being put in, not quite put into service yet, but seeing them seeing the care of it. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, this is cool. I'm like, for my job, I'm literally going to go take a picture of a brand new fire truck, and I'm more excited about that than most of my stuff for the day.
So Waukesha, or to be more accurate, Prairieville, has had a hook and ladder division since August 5th, 1852.
Right. Now, taking it back a few years earlier, of course, we know that Waukesha was settled by Morris Cutler in 1834, and it was called Prairieville, and then I think it was 1846 they changed to Waukesha, and 1847 is when Waukesha County broke away from Milwaukee County. So everything happened about in that same era. But in August 5th, 1852 is when Waukesha became officially a village. And part of the incorporation articles of the village were the formation of Reliance Hook and Ladder Company Number 1, which consisted of 28 volunteers. The village president was to be the chief. The sextons of all the churches were to ring the bells at the alarm of fire, and each homeowner was required to provide 1 bucket for that fire. And then they appropriated $106 and had a local wagon maker make a wagon, which was basically a ladder truck, extra buckets, some axes, and some other tools. So at that time, the fire departments, as a lot of them were, they were more of a social organization, and they had elaborate uniforms. I don't know how much really training they had. I don't think it was that organized, but it was people that were prominent in the community were in that group.
So is that kind of like the equivalent of like a moose lodge today, kind of a thing?
Something like that. And they put out fires that as much as they could at that time with buckets,
right?
But then they were disbanded at the start of the Civil War and then reformed afterwards. And then in 1869, they built the first, what they called the engine house. And that was a frame. Before that, the apparatus was kept wherever they had room, and it might be in somebody's barn or garage. And then if they had a fire, they haven't had one for 4 months, nobody knew where it was, and they had to pass the word around. It was sort of cumbersome.
Was it just human pushed at that point? Or
right. Right. It was hand-drawn. And then in 1869, they built that first engine house at 320 South Street, which is sort of across from where the Masonic Lodge is now in that building. It was a wood frame building, and in that building was the first fire bell. The one that I mentioned is down at Station 1 now. So they had 2 hand pumpers by that time in that fire. The ones where you stand on the side and pump.
Right.
Typical. You can see from those old pictures. But basically, fire departments back then, they protected exposures. They weren't expected to put the building out of fire, but they protected the surrounding buildings so it didn't expand. So that was really what they did. In 1882, they had a large fire at the Mansion House Hotel, and that prompted the city to invest and buy a steam fire engine. It was a LaFrance fire engine. They called it the General Hancock for whatever reason. But the problem with a steam pumper in small communities is in order to get a head of steam, it took about a half an hour. From now, bigger city departments like Milwaukee and Chicago, they had those steam pumpers piped into their furnace system,
so
which they kept
boiler
going all year long. So it was a matter of just lighting the fire, and by the time they got to the fire, they could pump. But in a small community, plus they were very complicated pieces to operate. As you can imagine, only 2 or 3 people could operate it. And then in 1884, they built their first really permanent fire station, masonry structure, which was on the corner of Madison and Clinton Street, sort of where the clock tower is.
Okay, yeah.
And that served as a fire station until 1956, so they got a lot of years out of that use. And then it was a city hall annex for several years after that. There's some pictures around. The cornerstone from that building I recovered, and now it is in Station 1 as you walk in the front doors. That's that corner stone from that 1884.
Okay.
See.
Yeah.
They also had a large bell tower on that building, and they with a much bigger bell. And they didn't have any horses at that time, so they would ring the bell, and then people in the community would bring horses or teams, and they'd get $2 for the first team and $1 for each subsequent team. So that's how they pull the apparatus to the fire.
So it kind of incentivizes you to get your horses ready to go
Absolutely.
in there quickly.
And everybody raced because they wanted double the money.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't have the water supply was basically the river, and then about that time, the city built 3 cisterns. I haven't been able to find out how many gallon cisterns they were. They talked about barrels, and if you look up historically, barrels are different size, so I don't know how much water. But one of those cisterns was at what is now Les Paul Middle School, which was the high school and the grade school at that time. And then one cistern was at Wisconsin and Broadway and East, where they meet. And then there was another cistern near White Rock in Main, East Avenue area. I'm assuming it was a little closer to the courthouse than White Rock. So those were cisterns.
And those were above ground cisterns? Or
no, they were in the ground cisterns. Okay. And then, of course, they had the river. So if you were far away from those places, there was really no water supply.
Did the apparatus that they have, did they have the ability to store the water at that point? Or it just
nothing.
You had to pump from them?
You had to use the suction and pump with the seamer and the hand truck. Now, one fire they had previous to that, in fact, it was very close to where Station 1 is now on St. Paul. They actually, back when they had all the old hand pumpers, they submerged one hand pumper in the river, and and pumped to the other pumper. So they could pump a ways from the river, but not up Madison Street Hill or anything like that.
No, I mean, I imagine any of the hills kind of around here would be a...
So really the biggest advancement in firefighting in the last 150 years was the waterworks being put in 1889. And when you think of, we take that for granted, but what an advancement to have a hydrant every 500 feet or whatever it was back then. And then they didn't need that steamer so much because they could hook their hoses right up to the hydrant and use that water pressure to put out fires, which they did for 75 years. Even when they got the first motorized pumpers, they still used those hydrant streams a lot. So that was a big... I want to tell you about Albert Mavis, who was the first firefighter killed in the line of duty, and you have your memorial right out front here. But a little story on Albert. On September 21st, 1890... First, Albert was a real gung-ho guy, young guy, gung-ho like a lot of them are. His whole life was a fire department. And he lived on Madison Street in a rooming house, and he worked at the Opera House as a gas man, which meant he was in charge of lighting all the gas lights. And so he was close by both in work and living to the fire station, so he was usually the first one there. And they had a fire at the Fountain Springs Hotel on South Grand Avenue at that date, and Albert was one of the first ones there, and he pulled this huge hose reel with two-wheeled hose cart out on the deck waiting for a horse team to come along. Well, a buckboard came along, and Albert sat on the back of the buckboard holding the tongue of the hose reel. They went down Clinton Street, turned east on Wisconsin, and just before they were going to turn south on Grand Avenue, Albert lost grip of the tongue. It went down. It hit a divot in the road, and the whole cart flew over the top and crushed Albert. And Albert was taken to the doctor's office. They said there's nothing could be done, and he died shortly after that. But that was a big deal for the fire department because he was sort of like their mascot. And if you go to Prairie Home Cemetery, they bought him a stone, and he's the only one in Prairie Home Cemetery that says anything about the Waukesha Fire Department on it, that he was a member. So he was the first firefighter killed in the line of duty responding to an alarm.
And one of these hose carts are like the ones that are outside of Station 4,
yes,
correct?
Only bigger, very bigger.
Okay.
I bet you those wheels are 8 foot high, big wooden wheels. And the hose that time was very heavy.
Was it leather instead of
it originally was leather sewn, and then it went to a heavy canvas. I don't know if that date exactly what it was. But
somewhere in that. It's not the same meshed kind of material that it is now.
Right. So he was the first firefighter killed in the line of duty. Then in the late 1890s, about 1898, they bought their first team of horses, Casey and Jim, which were a white matched team. In the early 1900s, you'll see a lot of people have matched teams. That was a big deal where they get a matched team. And they were at the firehouse, and they had stalls. And when the alarm came in, when the gong would ring, it would also, there was an electromechanical device that would open the stall doors.
Oh, cool.
So those horses would hear that gong, and they'd know what it was all about and run out. And I tell kids, what happens when you take your leash out and your dog sees it? Well, they start running around and jumping and yelping. That's exactly what the horses did. And they would wind their way around and get in position. Each one knew where to go. Then the harnesses would drop down from above, and they had a quick coupling that would couple that on, and they'd be ready to go.
Wow, that's really cool.
And it's about that time, 1900, that they hired the first full-time employee of the Waukesha Fire Department, John O'Brien. And he served actually 42 years on the department. But when they hired him, it wasn't as much as for a firefighter, but was for a driver for the wagon, somebody to feed the horses every day, somebody to exercise the horses and take care of them, answer the fire phone, and be at the station. So he was the first. And an interesting story, I think you heard that, but in 1907, when Casey and Jim were retired, they sold the pair. They retired them because they obviously got a fresher team. So they sold that team to the Biggs Funeral Home. And Biggs Funeral Home used those horses to pull the hearse. Well, one day, the regular hearse driver couldn't make it, and it was John O'Brien's day off, so they asked him to come over and drive the hearse that day. Well, John says he climbed on that wagon, and Casey turned his head and looked around and saw him and thought for an instant the glory days were back. And as John says, he took off like he was stung by a bee, and it took him like 3-4 blocks to slow him down with the body inside the hearse. So that was quite
it's quite an experience for everyone.
Well, those old guys said once the horses were gone, the job went to hell. I mean, they were so attached to those horses.
Right. I mean, it sounds like they have just as much personality as a pet at this point, too. And like, you know them so well.
Right. They were companions.
Yeah.
So when they were retired, it was probably because they moved on to
They needed a faster
coaches,
team of horses. They didn't get motorized quite yet. About that same time, the turn of the century, they got their first ladder truck. It wasn't an aerial ladder truck, but it was a long ladder truck that had a 50-foot ladder. And although it took 6 men, a 50-foot ladder could reach the top of a 4-story building or the window of a 5th story. So they were pretty much covered for rescues. And then in 1906, they hired their second employee, Frank O'Brien, which was John's brother. In 1910, the fire department was reorganized by state statute. And at that time, they had 2 drivers, a part-paid chief and assistant chief, 22 volunteers, and 4 horses. And I want to tell you something about Peter Wild. And Peter Wild, I consider as sort of the father of the Waukesha Fire Department. He's very influential. Nobody knows that name now, but 50 years ago, you'd mention Peter Wild, and everybody in the city would know him. And he lived in Slinger as a young man and came to Waukesha, and he was working at Al Frederer's blacksmith shop on South Street one day when Fire Chief Knippel at the time came by, and he was a strong young man, and said, "You might think joining the volunteer fire department," which he did in 1904. And he was another guy that was super crazy, and that became his whole life. And at the age of 26 in 1910, he was appointed chief of the department, a job he had until 1945.
So that's quite young for a chief usually.
Right. He was chief for 35 years, 42 years total on the job. And it was through his vision that the Waukesha Fire Department has become the great organization that it is today. With those beginnings, he was very progressive in his ideas and read everything. He was he had a mind that you could talk to him. He could remember every run that he was on those 42 years. He moved across from Station 2 and had a fire phone put in his house, so he answered every call to the fire department and went to every fire, even ones way out in the county. I'll tell you about that later. But so he was a very important person.
Is he the longest serving person for the fire department as well? Or pretty close at least?
Pretty close. There was another Art Schley who started in 1918 and retired in 59 or so. So that's about that same year. Nobody's going to equal that anymore.
It's tough to be in the service for 40 plus years.
Yeah, right. So at that time, they were making about 35 runs a year. And they had 18 to 20 men per run. Now, that's a lot because even today on a structure fire, if all stations respond, that's 26 guys usually. And if one station is out on a med run or something, you get 20 guys. So that's the manpower. They had a lot. But if you think about it, nobody went anyplace. Nobody left town. They were all around within a mile or 2 radius, so they were available for those runs. And I say runs, they're even called runs nowadays. They were called runs because the horses ran.
It makes sense.
A lot of that terminology, in fact, even when I started, when we would get back to the station, they'd say Engine 5 is back in quarters. Now they say back in quarters. Back in those days, we used to say we're back in the barn. Still the barn from when they had horses. So a lot of that stuff.
Everything's kind of back and put away.
And that's the tradition. One fire I want to mention of a lot of the big fires Waukesha had, although Waukesha never had a conflagration like a lot of cities did that took down blocks. And Waukesha's never had a high loss of life fire like other cities have. In fact, I did research after the parade to see if there was any situations where 5 people had died They hadn't. That was the first time that many. There was 3 that died in a car accident once, and 3 died in a fire, but that loss of life.
Relatively low. I mean,
Right. But in 1912, everybody knows the Rest Haven Hotel. Now it's the Ethnos, is it Ethnos?
Ethnos. I think Ethnos 360.
Bible Institute up on the hill.
Yes.
But that was a grand hotel at the time, and there was a bad fire there in 2012, which they managed to save it. Unbelievable. But they had a water main break on Wisconsin Avenue, and the steamer was in disrepair, and they couldn't use it. So they did what they did 5 times in Waukesha's history, is telegraph Milwaukee for help. And what they would do is Milwaukee would load an engine and horse teams and firefighters on a flatbed, and then they'd run an engine as a special out to Waukesha. Sounds sort of cumbersome, but in the records for the 1898 Boys School fire, they sent Engine 4 from 3rd and National in Milwaukee, and they got out here in 22 minutes.
On train. Yeah.
On a train.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine that ride?
So it's about, if you think it's about, 15 minutes now on a bad day to get from Milwaukee? So you're going 80, 90 miles per hour.
Right.
Yeah, and that's just like straight shot, no curves, no hills.
But they did that about 5 times, helped Milwaukee. Sometimes they got here in time, other times they didn't. But they did that for several fires. So in 1915, they bought their first motorized piece of apparatus, which was a 1915 Sterling hose and chemical wagon. Now, everybody thinks, well, naturally, they went to motorized because it was more efficient. Not really the case.
Nope.
Like now, back then, it was all about the money. And they did, I found what you would now call a spreadsheet. I don't know what they call it. Just study.
Ledger, maybe?
Ledger study, where in 1915, they spent $26 for driving this piece of motor apparatus 55 miles, but they cost them $131 to go 28 miles with the horse-drawn ladder truck. Yep. So because of, there's a lot of, oats, hay, upkeep, vet bills were a big thing. So that's why they transitioned to the motorized apparatus. That, and eventually it became more efficient than horses.
Right.
But now that piece of apparatus, I'll tell you a little bit about that later, that's still essentially here.
I think we've seen it in parades before.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
And it's been rebuilt twice. In 1918, a major thing happened. We decided to build a second station in Waukesha on the east side for 2 reasons. One, expansion on the east side. And secondly, the same problem we have today is there's trains constantly through the town. And they were afraid at that time that a train would somehow prevent responding to an alarm, breakdown of responding to the alarm. Still could be the far out case today. You don't know. And so they bought the rest. It's on the corner. It's still there. It's called Outdoor Outfitters now, building on the southwest corner of Hartwell and Arcadian.
Okay, yeah.
And that was originally the garage carriage house for the Rest Haven Hotel. So they bought that in 1918. Then that became the headquarters station because they had room for offices upstairs.
Makes sense.
And about that time, they started hiring full-time men, eventually to get to a full-time department. And one very interesting fact that I ran across, I ran across something in the Freeman that's talked about the Gettleman Law being passed. And in the Freeman, it says, according to this, the Gettleman Law said firefighters must have 24 hours off during each 7 continuous 24-hour days. And I thought, well, that can't be right. You wouldn't work 6 24-hour days and get one off.
See, that would be very tricky.
So I tried finding statutes, and I didn't have very much luck because I didn't know exactly where to look. So I wrote to the Secretary of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they came back with an answer. And yes, in fact, that was true for a 4th-class city. Now, as you know, census is taken every 10 years. So in 1910, we were a 4th-class city, so we qualified for that. So that actually was what their hour
So it
was.
was 6 days, 24
6
hours,
24
and then
hours,
1 day
but
off.
they were allowed to go home for lunch and dinner on alternate days. So it wasn't totally confined.
So you get lunch one day, dinner the next.
Yeah, right. And I understand that they could wander off like to pay the gas bill or something, but they'd have to be there.
Within earshot of the bell, I imagine.
And there was stories I heard about the Archley where he went in for the Common Council and he demanded, he says, I'm only with my wife 1 day a week. I don't think he used quite those words about that, but they eventually, and in 1920, they became a third-class city, which meant they got 24 hours off for every 3 continuous 24 days. It still wasn't bad, but that was 126-hour work week. The other one was 144-hour work week.
That's a hefty work week, yeah.
A lot.
In 1921, the last team of horses were retired from Station 2 that pulled the ladder truck. And by that time, they were up to about 80 runs a year with 10 paid and 16 volunteers. So you can see this transition is coming. 1926, the volunteer fire department was disbanded and went to a full-time paid department, still on the 126 hours. And in 1930, they went to a 2-platoon system, which meant you worked every other day. So you were down quite a bit in hours.
Right.
And 9 men worked and 5 were on call. Now, the call, guys on call, that stayed well into the 70s and into the 80s. And when I started in 75, half the shift going off duty had to be available for call. And being available mean you should be where they could call you by telephone. So theoretically, you couldn't leave your house, and if you did, you were supposed to call in a phone number where you'd be. And a couple of the old guys like Chief Baumgart would say when he was younger, and him and his wife would go out for a drive at night, they'd have to circle past the fire station every 15 minutes to make sure that they weren't out on a run.
Wow.
So that all changed with the Fair Labor Standards Act of the 90s. Then in 1951, they went to what they call the Kelly Days, which they got another day off. But it wasn't until 1968 that they went to the 3-platoon system, which is what they're on now, which basically you work 3 24-hour days out of every 9. And that's a 56-hour work week. And now they have work reduction days, so I think they're down to about 52 hours a week.
It's still a sizable amount of work, but
it's
much easier than the 144.
Hours. Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, most people don't realize that Waukesha covered a big rural area back in the day. And probably from the early 1920s until the mid-50s when some of the volunteer departments got formed in areas like New Berlin and Brookfield, Waukesha covered all of the town of Brookfield, Elm Grove, Butler, all in New Berlin, except for the southeast corner that was covered by Hills Corners, all of the town of Waukesha, the town of Genesee, and half of the town of Pewaukee. So that's
a pretty sizable
pretty
area.
big area. With one fire engine, with 90 gallons of water. And that fire engine, Engine 4, was a 1931 Purse. It's still there. And that was up at Station 2, and they'd leave with 3 guys, go down to Station 1, pick up 1 additional guy, and they'd head out Blue Mound or whichever way they were going. And they made long country runs. They also did mutual aid, a lot of times do Oconomowoc. And you heard of stories where it was like 10 below zero, and they're riding on the back of a fire engine out of Oconomowoc. So they covered that big area. Now, how did they do it with 90 gallons of water? Well, they had a system set up where they'd call a farmer and he'd call 2 farmers, and that each one of those 2 would call 2. They'd take their milk cans, which are 7 or 10 gallons, fill it full of water, put it on the back of their pickup truck, and all go to the fire. Then they had a big funnel, which is still up at Station 2. They put in that truck, and they'd have like a bucket brigade with these milk cans filling it, and they'd have water. Not enough, again, to put out the fire, but preventing the fire from spreading to the barn, to the house, or vice versa. So that the rural ones were a big deal. They also got $100 a run, which went back in the city coffers, so the city was happy
still
about
pretty
that.
sizable at the time, too,
Right.
Were these fires like often, because like now fires are like electrical fires or cooking fires, so how do you know like what the cause of most of these fires back then?
The number one cause of fires probably in 20s, 30s, 40s, and the 50s was careless use of smoking materials.
A Light a match, toss it away.
Yeah, that's sort of almost gone now. But people used to smoke in bed. Mm-hmm. People used to smoke in overstuffed chairs. A lot of fires and a lot of fire deaths in Waukesha were caused by that. By lot, I mean a dozen.
Right,
where people would be watching TV and smoking in their chair and fall asleep and they'd burn up. Mm. But that was also, there was a lot of chimney fires. Of course, a lot of
makes sense, yeah.
And they had a lot of chimney fires. But like you said, now it's more, I think, electrical
cooking,
else.
stuff like that.
Yeah, less accidental, more incidental.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I want to tell you about probably the worst day on the Waukesha Fire Department, which was May 11th, 1934. Mm-hmm. And that's when Frank O'Brien and Bernard McCaffrey, two firefighters, were killed in the line of duty. And they were riding on the tailboard of Engine 3. Charles Richards was driving, and Bill Godakovitz was the lieutenant. They were responding to a fire on North Greenfield Avenue from the downtown Clinton station. Mm-hmm. They were going out Main Street. When they got to Hartwell Avenue, just past Hartwell, there's that train crossing, mm-hmm. and there was a Sioux Line switch engine pulled in front of them. Now, two factors. There was supposed to be somebody that walked out from the switch engine with a flag, and secondly, they were going too fast. Mm-hmm. But they had hard rubber tires on this old engine, and they don't stop. Mm-hmm. So when they reached the intersection, Charles Richards pulled the emergency brake, and as the witnesses said, the engine just bounded and skipped along, unable to stop, and at the last minute, he swung it so the rear end went around and hit that train. Frank O'Brien was thrown off, his leg was cut off, and he was dragged 200 feet. And Bernard McCaffrey got a pike pole through the chest.
Ouch.
And they died shortly after that. So that was a very big thing. Mm-hmm. And I talked to a lot of old people that lived in that era, and they all talked about how Waukesha's phone system completely went down because everybody was calling everybody else. It was a small town back then.
Mm-hmm.
And
the switchboard can only handle so much.
Everybody knew these people, and this was a huge, sort of like what the Christmas parade was mm-hmm. now on a different scale back then, So now that truck that was the original 1915 Sterling truck that was rebuilt in 1927, mm-hmm. and then that was crashed. So the city rebuilt it, and it was retitled as a 1934 Persh. That is the same truck that's out at Station 2 right now, mm-hmm. and you see in the Christmas parade and in the 4th of July parade usually. Mm-hmm. That's that same truck. So
they would have been sitting or standing on that.
They would have been standing on
basically.
The back. Yeah. Right. When I first started, we rode on the tailboard.
Mm-hmm.
Now you look at it and say, how crazy was that?
Yeah,
right.
But on the other hand, I look back at how thrilling.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
It's both exciting and also, a lot can go wrong.
Right.
It's fascinating that because those are the 3 deaths that the fire.
Those are the 3 deaths, and they were all responding to alarms. And if you look nationally at fire deaths, you'll find I don't know if it's the most, but it's right up there. Mm-hmm. Responding.
You would
dangerous.
You would think they would be in the fire doing something.
And now there's a lot of guys killed. You see so many at car accidents where they're out helping people, mm-hmm. and you see, you can go on YouTube and see all these people just driving in. That's another very danger too. Mm-hmm. So the job is a lot safer than what it used to be.
100%.
Yeah. So, in just to recap from there on, the next really big thing that happened was May 28th, 1981, and that's when Waukesha went to the 4-station concept. Mm-hmm. And they built 3 new stations. They built one on Century Drive, one on Northview that's still there, and they moved Station 2 out to Wolf Road and Moreland Boulevard. So that was a big thing.
It's pretty good coverage from there.
They still only had 2 ambulances, so 2 of those stations were manned just with an engine, and that's when the city started sending an engine as a first responder to a medical emergency. Mm-hmm. So now let's get into EMS.
Yeah. So this year we're getting ready to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the city's first paramedic program. So do you know how that program came about and
I'm
its
going to
impact?
just tell you a little bit of background of the EMS before that. I'm not letting you off the hook.
Oh, no, 100%, yeah.
Okay, so in the late 1800s to early 1900s, mid 1900s, maybe, if you were hurt, you would go to a doctor's office. Even the hospital didn't have an emergency room originally. So that's how sick people and people hurt were treated. It wasn't, and then if you needed transport, you'd call a funeral home and they would send an ambulance to take you. Well, in the 1940s, the Waukesha County Sheriff's Department bought 2 ambulances stationed at the old courthouse there for the whole county and provided ambulance service. And they had 1 driver. So they would go out to Merton for a car accident and they'd pick up somebody, but they did, since they only had 1 person, they would depend on passerbys or other people there or another sheriff's car to help load. They would drive, 1 person would drive that with no care to the patient on the way to the hospital. I think that's where that term "dead on arrival" came from.
Right, that would make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Waukesha firefighters under Chief Wild since the 20s, they were trained with advanced Red Cross in the Schaefer method of artificial respiration, which I don't know if you've ever seen pictures. They used to lay people on face down, and they would put their arms out and work their arms to work their diaphragm. It's probably on YouTube. And that's how they would try to resuscitate people.
Interesting.
It didn't work. But in 1932, on September 18th, Waukesha bought what they call a resuscitator, an E&J resuscitator. And it's basically like a ventilator. It has 2 oxygen tanks, and you could either manually operate to inflate the lungs with oxygen or set it on automatic mode and sort of strap it to the head that it would breathe the patient. And Waukesha had one before the hospital did.
Which is bizarre, really.
And you can see in the old run books where they'd have a squad run to, they called it municipal hospital at the time, to help resuscitate a patient. I think that's really bizarre.
Yeah,
but that's like, how advanced Waukesha
We're
Fire
calling
Department
911
was.
to get the fire department to come to the hospital to heal someone.
Right. And then the rural runs, if somebody drowned at Lake 5 or Muskego, the sheriff's department would send a squad to Station 1, pick up 1 man in that resuscitator, and drive out to Lake 5 to try to resuscitate a drowning victim.
Wow.
So I think it worked once in a while, but most of the time I don't think it worked. Well, in 1959, the fire department bought a station wagon, Ford station wagon. They called it Rescue 6, and they staffed it with 3 people, that resuscitator, and a cot. So that's the first time that they actually would transport a patient. But at the same time, the police department also had their own ambulance service with ambo wagons, they had station wagon squad cars. And besides patrolling, they would respond basically to basic life support, a car accident or broken leg or
kind of first aid, first aid based things.
And but in 1966, the city decided that the fire department should best handle the emergency ambulance service, much to the dismay of the police chief at the time. And police chiefs wanted to hang on to that. And in Milwaukee, Chief Breyer, who was chief, he didn't want the fire department to take over ambulance service. He wanted that for the police because they felt 80% of the calls involved an investigation. And who better to investigate than the police while riding to the hospital with the patient? That was the thought back then.
Interesting.
But so the city prevailed in moving it. And the big controversy at that time was the city wanted to buy Cadillac ambulances, 2 of them for $14,000 each. Well, you could buy a Chevy panel truck for $8,000. So the Freeman ran many editorials against this. They had finally a tourist attraction in Waukesha, the Cadillacs. Gold-plated this. They didn't. A lot of people were against that. And one alderman, Sigmund Snopek, who's the father of Tim Snopek, the photographer, he prevailed and he sort of put through that ambulance deal. So you got to give him credit for that.
Yeah.
So Waukesha had the 2 Cadillac ambulances in 1966, which was a great program. In 1972, they were trained as EMTs. Also, I found an interesting note. Back in 1963, Dr. Joe Bardos, and it's a famous name in Waukesha, most old people remember Dr. Joe, he instructed the fire department on closed heart massage. This was before CPR, because CPR was sort of in the late 60s. So Waukesha was pretty on top of it.
It's very progressive. Yeah.
So in 1975, Waukesha started its paramedic program. Now, I can't understate how important that TV show Emergency, that's still on, was at that time. We didn't have many TV shows back then, and that was a popular one. And that told people all over this country, explained to them what the paramedic program was and how they could, and this is what they said at this time, bring the emergency room to the scene and to the patient, which is basically what it was. So Waukesha started thinking about this. Actually, LA, Seattle, Miami, Philadelphia, they were the first ones. And in Wisconsin, Madison was in 72, West Allis 73, Tosa and Janesville in 74. So this was something that was happening. So a program was started by Chief Land from the fire department and Dr. Haupert from Waukesha Memorial Hospital, a joint program that they wanted paramedics. So they hired a nurse coordinator, Marilyn Freund, and her and Dr. Haupert went out to Seattle. They wanted to model Waukesha's program after Seattle. And they had a big fund drive to raise $60,000, which in today is about $360,000, but I don't think you could do it for $360,000 today. But the Women's Club in Waukesha gave the first $10,000. They had many dances, fundraisers, they had paramedic bumper stickers. It was a big deal to raise this money, and they raised the money by April. And on April 7th, 1975, almost 50 years ago, they trained the first 10 men. And they bought the Cube, which was the first Cube-type ambulance, and they called it Alpha 10 for the first 10, Alpha for the first 10.
That's perfect.
Alpha. So that was the name of that rig, and all the reports, Alpha 10. So the unit, they were trained at the hospital, 1,000 hours of total training to be a paramedic, exactly the same what it is today, pretty much. And they went online June 21st, but they had an exchange program with West Allis and Wauwatosa. Every day, one of Waukesha's paramedics went to that city, and one of their paramedics came out here to sort of be more supervision, and that happened until October. And then they trained 3 more paramedics in 78. I was one of those 3, and then 3 in 79, 3 in 81, so forth, to the point now where all new hires have to be paramedics before they get through with their probationary period. And I think about 70 or 75% of the total department now is paramedics. So it's come a long way in the 50 years, but it's something that the city really needed and made a big difference.
Yeah. I mean, looking at when we're hiring for fire department, it is fire and EMT 1 is usually the introduction, and it makes a lot of sense because I think like a vast majority of their calls now are medical calls.
Yeah. And that started changing about 1966 when I think, and I'm just pulling these numbers on my head, I think right now about 85% are medical calls and 15 are other. But that chart changed when they went in that ambulance service in 65, where it started to be the 60-40 and then creeping up through the years. And that changed the department in a lot of ways. When I started, the fire department was more fire-orientated and less EMS-orientated. And when the paramedic, there was a lot of social changes in the fire department at that time, because a lot of the old guys thought fires, that's what we're here for. We don't want to send those engines out for medical runs.
Right.
Well, that has completely changed. So. It's changed for the good.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a service-focused job, but yeah, it's definitely a almost a more community-centric job because of that EMS side of stuff. Of we're out to help people regardless of the situation that they're in.
And the whole county has changed. A lot of these smaller departments that are almost volunteer or paid on call have paramedics. I don't know how they do it, how they get people to put that kind of commitment and hours of training, because that's not their real job, know. But the department is changed. The training is just unbelievable now compared to what it was. When I started, there was no such thing as water rescue. Never even a thought about that, and now we have guys trained in water rescue.
It's starting to hear like of all the, like, especially the recent years where it's, we're going to be working with a lot of the lake country cities on, we've got resources here. How can we, cross share resources and everything?
But there was one run I was on, and I think about 1980ish, where a car went into the Fox River on the South Bypass. It was upside down in the river, and we didn't know if there was 4 people in there or nobody in there or nothing. And there was no real plan at that time. Divers. There was no dive teams. The dispatcher knew of somebody that was a scuba diver and called that person. That's what happened. As a result, it was fine. There was nobody in there. But
Right, but there's so many things you're like, okay, what it's playing the what if game, in which no one loves playing.
Right,
so,
right.
All right, what can we plan for and
right.
And now, like, I've done videos for each of the fire stations. Like, each station now has their own subsection where it is cool. We've got the water team rescue.
Right.
We've got the
confined spaces.
Or I can't think of all of them, but there's each of the 5 have their own thing, which is incredible.
Yeah,
to
we
see how
never
much it developed.
practiced climbing towers.
Yeah, exactly.
Rappelling, that just wasn't in the program.
Yeah.
You didn't have like they've got the fire training building. Like you probably didn't have a building. It was like, just light this building on fire, casually and be able to handle it.
The job completely has changed. It's much more professional. Not that we weren't professional. We were professional with what we knew at the time.
For the time being,
You can only be professional in what you know, but
Although the paramedic hasn't changed a lot. It really has. It's a lot of the same procedures and protocols and drugs. It's from what I see, there's new innovations in the equipment, but essentially you're doing the same stuff.
You see a lot of the similar bedside manner kind of things, and let's get you stable so we can get you to the place where they can really fix you up and patch you up if you need it.
Right.
So you were part of the initial paramedic.
Well, not the
program.
initial 10, but the next
The
group.
next
but
group.
pretty darn close.
But during that 10, I was an EMT driver for the paramedic unit.
Okay.
So I was on.
You were the honorary of the 10.
Well, there's others, but
Yeah.
Can I mention those 10 guys?
Yeah, sure.
I want to give them the due. There was at the time Lieutenant Ron Honegger, Lieutenant Wayne Faulkner, Lieutenant Jim Lowy, the late Larry Jones, Warren Coomer, the late Lou Benavides, Charlie Griffith, Ron Wiesner, Elliot Miller, and the late Mike Biondo. And the fire department is planning to have something in early May. They want to get as many guys. I think we might be able to get 5 back, at least 4, maybe 5 of those guys back. They plan on doing something to recognize them for that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, 50 years in the program of having the program
well,
and being relatively new with.
Now, to me, it just sounds like the other day, but I was there.
I mean, we're celebrating the 50 years. I mean, we were obviously very grateful for all they've done and it's all you've done as well.
Yeah, it's taken for granted now, of course, but yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so was Waukesha like 6th, 7th in the state for having a program for the most part, or
yeah, there's 1, 2, 3, about 6th, I think.
You'd say for not being. Well, did Milwaukee even have a program yet at that point?
Milwaukee's didn't start, I think, till about 79, 80-ish, 81.
Did they ever have those situations where Milwaukee would call for aid or anything like that from it?
And they were, of course, we had the problem back then is when people live outside the city limits, they thought, well, we can call the paramedics.
Yeah.
And a couple times they called, and depending on who was in charge at that time, they might have sent somebody right over the border. But that stopped because the mayor at that time said, nope, paramedics are bought and paid for by the city of Waukesha. They're staying in the city limits. So, but other communities have
those shared resources, or it's
Right,
like
right.
might be volunteer, but like that shared resource of
they have intercepts with paramedics and
I'm
contracts.
thinking like your Salem, Silver Lakes kind of area where it's
Right, but Waukesha doesn't with the paramedics. Like, except on a mutual aid basis where they would call an engine to back up or through the MABUS.
Yes, and I can imagine then, for larger incidents, you
Right,
may
then,
call in.
if Lake Country would say we need a med unit to fill in at our station or even at the fire, they would on a mutual. Just like we'll call Pewaukee if all 5 of ours are out and there isn't anything. And that happens quite a bit.
Yep.
That mutual aid is very good.
Occasionally, I would imagine during snowstorms, things get pretty busy here around. And it's like
well,
you just need that extra hand if you can get it.
Yeah, and of course with the Christmas parade, we had resources coming in from all over the place.
Yeah, 100%.
What would you say are some of the biggest milestones that the Waukesha Fire Department has accomplished since its founding? I mean, you've seen the history of it all. What do you think kind of stands out most?
I think that as far as I think that waterworks deal was probably one of the biggest, although that wasn't a Waukesha Fire Department deal. But the opening of the stations, going to full time in 1926, and of course the going to the 4 stations, and of course now we have a 5th station. And in 1980, I think those were 2 of the big milestones, and the paramedic program probably.
Is there technology now, or just even any advancements now that you're just kind of like, I don't know, baffled by, but just like it's amazing to see how far it's come?
Maybe even jealous of.
Yeah, right.
Well, they have a automatic CPR machine now where they put on a person, and it's just amazing that
Is it like the arch-shaped one that kind of does the compressions?
Right. Is it called a leap or something?
Something like that, yeah.
Something, I shouldn't.
See, I only know the not so fun colloquial name of the geezer
And they
squeezer,
say it'll do a better
unfortunately.
job than a person does.
Yeah.
And consistently, and that doesn't get tired.
And you say, it'll go that, 100 BPM perfectly that it needs to go. And so talking about the paramedic program, can you tell us some of your memories as a time as a paramedic and your time in the department that are, fond memories for you?
Well, I have a lot of fond memories. As you get older, you tend to remember the good stuff and not the bad, although there's some people that doesn't work. But I just have fond memories and working with the people. And the unique thing about that job is no matter how many years you're there, you know people better than you will ever get to know a friend or a person.
I hear so frequently from people in the fire department that it's so much like that brotherhood and camaraderie that kind of like it is that familial kind of. I
tell people, you could be sitting in a room and someone could walk in behind you and you know who that person is by the sound of their footsteps. Now that sounds really, or the sound of their breathing. And that's the way it was.
That's that there's that close bond and kinship.
I think it was more then than there is now. Because, I go to the stations now, and of course they all have their individual rooms. And at 6 o'clock at night, I'll say, "Where is everybody?" But they're all in their room with their devices. Yep. Where in the old days, we would be sitting out on the ramp all together in our captain's chairs, tilted back, telling stories. So there was that extreme sense of really knowing the people that you're with.
I do feel like it changes kind of by the stations, because I feel like that's the mentality I kind of see with Station 4, where they've got like that. You come into the building and it's their living room with their chairs there.
Yeah.
And
see, that's a little different with 4 than the other ones.
Little more communal.
Right.
We're all going to be here. If you need to go and have a private space, you can. But it's much more the family life.
Yeah, and there were disagreements, of course, different views, but once that alarm rang, then that was over.
You all had the same goal.
Yeah. No, it was exhilarating, and I enjoyed it while I was there.
And how many years were you?
Actually, I was only there 10. I went to a different career, but I never really left.
Yeah. 100%. Never would have guessed.
Yeah. And I go there now, and I know a lot of the people a lot of the old timers and retirees don't go there because they don't know anybody. But I've kept up a lot of those friendships with the newer guys and have have got to know them, and especially since with the really young guys going through the history with them, So I've sort of kept up with that. But it's a great group of people right now. I can't say enough. I don't think most of the people in the city here realize how great. Well, as our new chief, and I think he got that idea real quick.
In talking with him, he realized that. I mean, he knows that not that coming from Green Bay was not great, but he found out that there's
something here that there isn't.
We're overly Midwest in a weird way.
Yeah, right.
You take the Midwest stereotype, and it's everyone's friendly to each other, caring about each other.
And I think you can trace that back to all the leadership. Chief Howard, Chief Lacani, Stedman, Seidel, Baumgart, Land. Going back to all the chiefs, of which I've met all of them except one.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. That makes me old.
But it's also a good thing to brag about that you've met. I can't even. Was it what? Fifth? I'm trying to guess based on the website. Is it 15 chiefs that the city's had so far?
Well, I'm
ish.
Paid chiefs from 1910 were Peter Wild, and then Emery Downey, who's a real gruff guy, but he served from 45 to 65. And I visited with him. Then after him, Bert Lockerman took over. He was only there a year, and he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Oh. Then Glenn Land took over. He's the guy that hired me. He took over in 66. And after Glenn Land was Fred Baumgart, then Jerry Seidel, then Bob Stedman, then Al Lacani, then Steve Howard. No, before Steve Howard, Jesse Elba was chief for a short period of time. And then Steve Howard, and then the current chief.
So 11. Okay.
Yeah.
And then not including the many city or town leaders during the not paid times.
And there were volunteer chiefs. George Knipfel was a chief, and I'd have to look at the names back then.
So with the volunteer program, I know other cities use their tornado sirens to kind of identify. Did we ever have a point where our volunteers were summoned by siren instead of bell?
No, just bells.
Just bells.
Just bells. And the last time the Waukesha Fire bell rang was when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic.
Oh, wow. That's very cool.
They rang the church bell, and then not too many years after that, they took the tower down because it needed repair, and they took the tower down. So
that's a fantastic little fact.
Yeah, fun fact. So I know you were telling some of the fun, interesting stories, especially when the old fire chief was running the horses for the cemetery, and then they kind of went crazy. I know there's a fun story about the fire dogs too. Would you want to share that?
Sure.
As well?
If we got time, I'll tell you about Waukesha's most famous fire dog. Okay, so fire stations always had fire dogs, especially back in the early 1900s, when they had horses.
Were they always Dalmatians?
No, they weren't.
Okay.
Waukesha always had small terriers.
Okay.
And from the pictures, they looked like a Jack Russell Terrier, although I don't know if they were Jack Russells back then. I don't know enough about dog
rat
breeds.
terriers.
Yeah, but they were that. But the bigger cities had Dalmatians. They would calm the horses. They would be friends to the firefighters and the horses. They would take care of all small rodents, and they were pets. And also in the bigger cities, they would run with the apparatus, and they would guard the horses because the firefighters would take the horses off the apparatus and corral them, and those dogs would guard those horses from people interfering. So that was
interfering, wandering off, all that sort of thing.
So Waukesha had a couple dogs. One was Twinkles, and one was Tumbles, who looked like maybe his brother or son or back in the day. But the most famous dog was a dog that originally started out as Daisy Jane. And then his name was later changed to Sparky because the kids would come to the firehouse and see the dog and say, "Hey, Sparky." So they figured they might as well change his name. But Daisy Jane got here when Rest Haven was a veterans rehabilitation hospital after World War II. A serviceman who was a survivor of Wake Island was staying here. And his wife came to visit him, and she brought their dog, Daisy Jane. But the place she was staying, she wasn't allowed to keep a dog, so she gave it to the fire station, which is right down the hill. So they took care of it and taught it tricks. It would paw out cigarette butts. It would jump through hoops, things. But it loved to go on fire runs. And when the fire department always had two phones. They had a fire phone and a business phone. And the fire phone always had a different rig. They called it the big one. They'd say, that's the big one when that rang. And so when that fire phone rang, then Sparky, as he was called in, would start twirling around in circles and yelping. And then he'd make a mad dash to the ladder truck, because that was his preferred ride. He'd jump up on the ladder truck, and there was a turntable, and that's where he would sit and ride that fire. But if he was sitting there, and let's say it was a grass fire and only the engine was going, then he'd make a beeline over and jump on the running board of the engine and ride to the fire. He stayed on that rig during the fire, so he was no hassle to anybody. And then if they were upstairs at Station 2, because that's where they had their lunchroom and that's where they slept, he'd be up there with them. He'd run over by the pole hole and stay there, and the last firefighter down would grab his arm around him as he was coming down and bring Sparky down.
Traveling in style.
Yeah. So he would ride to the fires, and one time he was riding, and I don't know if they turned a corner too fast or whatever, they saw Sparky fly off the side of the fire engine and hit the curb. They thought he was dead. He was laying there, but they couldn't stop, so they kept on going. And on the way back from the fire, he wasn't there. So they didn't know what happened to him, but sure enough, when they got back to the station, he was sitting on the bench waiting for him.
Clever dog.
So his biggest joy, though, was riding in parades. And they would take the ladder truck, as that was their newest piece of equipment. Did I say this was started in like about 47, 48? Yeah, okay. And they would put a red ribbon around his neck, and he would stand up there on the ladder truck, and whatever side of the street there was more people on, that was the side he would favor. So he'd lean over to one side, and then he would lean over to the other side. And we have pictures of that. You might have saw those of him riding in that parade. Well, he got too old to be at the firehouse, so Captain Fred Baumgart took him home. He lived on Douglas Avenue, which was quite a ways from Station 2 over on Hartwell. And there. But every once in a while, he'd disappear. But Fred knew where to find him. He'd drive to the station. He managed to find his way back to be with the boys.
Super clever.
Such a smart dog.
Yeah. So since then, there has been no dogs.
Yeah.
Sad.
Yeah, I think there'd be quite a few of them that appreciate him.
Oh yeah, a dog.
Oh yeah, but they don't have time for that.
Oh yeah.
And now that also then gives us the origin for the mascot the fire department has, which is Sparky as well.
Right.
That one's a Dalmatian.
That one is a Dalmatian, not a Jack Russell. But
there's always time to change. But
exactly. Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's all the questions we had.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for.
It was a pleasure to be here and telling the stories.
History.
I never get sick of them. I can.
You say this. Yeah, this is the second time I've heard you explain the history, and it's. I'm sure there's much more that we can learn about it.
And I do have the book, Spring City Saviors. It's available at the Waukesha County Historical Society Museum gift shop.
Perfect.
If anybody is interested.
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Or directly from me.
Yeah.
And I have a few copies of the 350 left. So
perfect.
I don't know if I'll reprint it when they're gone, but.
Well, you never know. Maybe there'll be a big boom of book sales coming.
Right. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed it.
And that's a wrap for another episode of Talkin' Waukesha. We hope you enjoyed diving into the heart of our city with us.
If you have a story to share or just want to say hello, reach out to us on social media at City of Waukesha on Facebook. We love hearing from our listeners.
Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review if you enjoyed the conversation. It really helps us spread the word.
As always, thanks for tuning in to Talkin' Waukesha, where every conversation springs to life.